Is subversion inherently better than the expansion of pre-existing tropes? Especially in a genre such as isekai, a lot of the discussion tends to be around separating the good, subversive isekai from the bad, standard isekai. While this discussion of upholding pre-existing tropes or subverting them isn't limited to the isekai genre, in fact we tend to see it a lot in the discussion of shonen, I would say that no other genre is as criticized for its tropes as isekai. Perhaps, as some say, it comes from the tropes being inherently bad. However, I believe it has more to do with the oversaturation of isekai every single season, and how so many of them tend to stick very closely to the tropes of the genre. As such, for a while, most of the praise towards isekai was pointed at those that subverted what we expect from it, be it ReZero for deconstructing the power fantasy of the isekai main character, Konosuba for its parody of every aspect of the genre, or to a lesser degree things such as Grimgar of Fantasy and Ash for its more grounded take on isekai. And for a while, like many others, I believed the tropes of isekai to be inherently flawed. But then I watched Mushoku Tensei. Now if you aren't caught up with either ReZero or Mushoku Tensei, I'd highly recommend you do so, and although it won't be major for anything outside of Season 1 of ReZero, I'll give out a spoiler warning for both series if you'd prefer to go into it completely blind. Now without further ado, let's get into how ReZero and Mushoku Tensei subvert and uphold tropes respectively, and how that works in their favor. We all know by now how ReZero takes the generic isekai formula, squeezes it into a tiny box, twists it until it's broken and throws it in the trash to be forgotten. Just like Rem. The best way to showcase how ReZero subverts tropes is by taking a look at Subaru. Subaru isn't a nigh omnipotent and omnibenevolent Jesus-kun. He is everything but. He is rude, prideful, powerless, and not the brightest tool in the shed. Now while you could point out to return by death as a powerful tool that makes him overpowered, I'd have to disagree. He might have unlimited tries at solving a puzzle, but that doesn't mean he has access to the right pieces. As an example, you could give me infinite attempts at dunking on LeBron, but it doesn't mean I'll actually be able to do it. If anything, you could argue return by death is more of a curse. Not only does he have to go through the agony, both mental and physical, of dying and losing everyone he loves over and over again, but also the existential dread of having no one remember the previous timelines. And he doesn't even get the charisma boost that being reincarnated in another world usually implies. He isn't particularly attractive and tends to leave a negative first impression due to his off-putting behavior, granting him a negative reputation that he's only able to shake off through a lot of work and self-improvement. So when it comes to isekai as a self-insert power fantasy, Subaru is more likely to make you cringe with his decisions or make you pity him than he is to make you wish you were him. And the best way to show us how ReZero could have looked if Subaru was the standard OP protagonist is present from the very first arc of the show, Reinhard. Reinhard is, in essence, the standard isekai protagonist. He wields the legendary sword, has every power in the book, even the power to not confuse sugar and salt. Yes, that's a thing. He is canonically one of the most attractive in the verse, and every adjective used to describe him makes him sound like a god among men. He is who Subaru thought he was going to be when he got isekai'd, and ReZero goes out of its way to show how far from that Subaru is. But subversion for subversion's sake isn't any better than the alternative. There is such a thing as a bad subversion. What makes ReZero great isn't death, gore, and a darker tone. If so, we would look at Akame ga Kill as a great subversion of the shonen genre. What makes subversion work is the fact that it has something to say about the genre it wants to subvert. ReZero takes the wish fulfillment of the standard isekai protagonist, and unlike its contemporaries, it doesn't tell you that you are perfect as you are, and just a victim of circumstance, capable of greatness if only in the right situation, but instead, that you should learn to accept who you are, and fall in love with the process of becoming a better you. Mushoku Tensei, however, mostly follows what we tend to call the generic isekai formula, and it shows us that sometimes it's not the recipe, it's the chef. Once more, I think the best starting point is the protagonist, Rudius. In every single way, he is the most generic isekai protagonist, and while you might disagree right away based on the depth of his characterization, let me explain. Rudeus is the typical, overpowered, charismatic, good-willed, slightly pervy Jesus-kun archetype to everyone but the viewer. The difference doesn't come from Rudeus conceptually as a character. The people in this world would rationally think of him the same way the cast of any isekai would of most isekai protagonists. What makes him stand out to us is the context of who he is on the inside, that we gain from his internal monologue. Without it, he is the generic isekai protagonist. The difference doesn't come from the shape of the puddle, but from its depth. We know of all the bad thoughts he has, and we know of how he sometimes takes good actions, not from the good in his heart, but for the benefits he might get from it. So had we not been given access to his headspace and thought process, we would be unaware of anything but the cookie-cutter persona he plays on the outside. And he is in fact overpowered. From the eyes of those in his world, he's an unbelievably talented mage, thanks to using voiceless magic. However, this is only thanks to how he had the knowledge of an adult, yet the learning capacity of a kid when he first started out. He isn't naturally special. This isn't the same as a character having a secret fifth element or something similar. And we see that from how Sylphiet is just as capable of learning voiceless incantations as Rudeus, and thus they manage to make him overpowered to an extent, while not making us as the viewers think he had an unfair advantage, or at least not to the extent of other shows. And also, unlike with Subaru, most people like him right away, just like with the Jesus-kuns. Why does it feel more natural here? Once more, we have context that no one else has. To everyone in his world, he's incredibly mature and responsible for a kid. That's what earns him favor with the adults, and even when it comes to the love interests in the series, their relationships take a lot longer to develop than the usual one episode and they fall in love. And lastly, when it comes to the thematic core of isekai, which tends to surround the question of what would you do if you had nothing to stop you from becoming the best version of yourself? Unlike the more cynical take of ReZero, Mushoku doesn't outright deny the possibility of a picture-perfect fresh start in itself. It instead explores what someone would do with that opportunity, and if it even would make that much of a difference. And so once more, what allows Mushoku Tensei to feel well written while upholding most isekai tropes is the context and depth that is added to them. It doesn't solely rely on tropes, it expands them. Tropes tend to have a negative connotation, even more so in genres such as isekai, that are generally regarded as relying too much on them. However, I believe the execution matters more than the concept. At the end of the day, genres are akin to discussions, every piece released presenting their own ideas on what the genre should be. Upholding and subverting tropes becoming much like arguments in favor or against said genre conventions. One isn't inherently better than the other, as their value doesn't come from the position held, but from the validity of said argument. To stay on this metaphor, a bad argument in favor of a position does not invalidate a good argument in favor of that same position. Thus, bad execution upon a trope doesn't invalidate a good execution of that same trope. And neither is every counter-argument inherently going to be able to properly counter the original argument. Thus, a subversion's value doesn't come from subverting the genre by itself, but from how it subverts it. However, as it tends to be when it comes to discussions of art, we have to remember, subjectivity is a large factor. And that's why I'd love it if you could drop your own opinion. I'd love to go through the comments and see what you guys think of tropes in isekai and whether you need to be subversive or not to stand out. I'd like to thank you for sticking until the end, and without further ado, I'm Ayvhel, signing out.